Hello and welcome to another GCSE history revision video. This one focuses on paper 3 and looks at how the Nazis developed a police state in Germany from 1933 to 1939. The first big point is that the Nazis set up a police state in Germany from 1933. This meant a country in which the police were used by the government to control everything people did and said. Germans' rights and freedoms were strictly limited or removed altogether. Hitler was able to do this using the powers which had been granted to him in the Enabling Act. Here are the three main aspects of the police state: police agencies, concentration camps, and the Nazis' control of the legal system. We're going to take a look at each of these three areas. Let's look at the Nazi police agencies. Firstly, the SS or Schutzstaffel, which means protection squad. It was the largest and most important of the Nazis' police agencies. Set up first in 1925, it was put under the control of Heinrich Himmler in 1929, and from there it grew into an elite force of 250,000 men. It was the Nazis' ruthless paramilitary force. The role of the SS increased through the 1930s. It became the main means of removing opposition and intimidating Germans into obedience. In its early years, the SS began as a racially pure bodyguard for Hitler and the other Nazi leaders. Until 1934, it was a division of the SA. However, during the 1934 Night of the Long Knives, the SS proved its loyalty and its importance to Hitler by carrying out the purge of Röhm and the SA with ruthless efficiency during the Night of the Long Knives. This was a turning point for the SS. From this point onwards, it operated independently from the SA, adopted its characteristic black uniforms, and grew to become the biggest and most powerful organisation in Nazi Germany. It controlled all the other police and security forces, operated the concentration camps, and later carried out the mass murder of the Holocaust. Next, the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, which means Security Service. It was a subdivision of the SS, organised by Reinhard Heydrich. It operated as a uniformed intelligence agency, and it grew to around 6,000 men by 1940. The majority of its members were educated professionals, including lawyers and professors. After the Nazis took power and began to set up a one-party state, there was a massive influx of new members into the party. The Nazis were concerned that this might include spies and political opponents from other political parties. The role of the SD was to operate as an intelligence agency, gathering information on any potential enemies both inside and outside the Nazi party. The SD was divided into different departments, each one focused on a different group of opponents, and these included both political enemies such as communists and other nationalist parties, but also racial enemies like Jews. It monitored and kept detailed records of people who were suspected of opposing the Nazi regime, both in Germany and abroad. The SD had no power to actually arrest these people, but it reported opponents to the SS for arrest and removal. For example, during the Night of the Long Knives, it was the SD who helped to compile lists of suspected opponents to be murdered. The SD was also responsible for preparing detailed reports on public opinion for the Nazi leadership, who used these reports to monitor attitudes towards the regime's policies among the German population. The third police agency was the Gestapo. This was the Nazis' ununiformed secret police force, also under the leadership of Reinhard Heydrich. Their headquarters was in Prince Albrecht Street in Berlin. They employed 30,000 agents nationwide by 1939, and they also had a network of informers throughout Germany. Their role was to monitor and spy on the German population, identifying anyone who opposed the Nazis. Here you can see a teletype room in the Gestapo headquarters, where information about Nazi opponents was collected and collated. Their day-to-day work included snooping on people's conversations, through phone tapping and reading people's mail. From 1936, the law was changed to give the Gestapo unlimited powers to operate outside the law. This meant they were able to use torture when questioning suspects and forcing confessions out of them. This included near drownings in ice-cold water, electric shocks, beating, whipping, and burning flesh. The Gestapo building in Berlin became notorious because people in the streets outside could hear the screams of prisoners being tortured in the cellars. The Gestapo could strike anywhere at any time against ordinary Germans. It could imprison opponents and send them to concentration camps without trial. It even had the power to take people into protective custody, which meant protecting the Nazi state by arresting suspected opponents before they had even committed a crime. Next, let's look at the role of concentration camps. These first began to be set up and operated by the SS in the run-up to the Reichstag fire in 1933. They were established in disused factories and cellars, but also in specially built barbed wire enclosures in rural areas of Germany. By 1939, there were 6 of them within Germany, housing about 20,000 prisoners, both male and female, in separate camps. Their role was to punish and correct enemies of the Nazi government, indeed anybody who refused to conform to the expected behaviour of the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft or national community. Prisoners were classified into different categories and made to wear different colour triangles to represent this. For example, black triangles for vagrants and red triangles for political prisoners. While in camps, prisoners could expect to be questioned and taught the error of their ways through tough punishments. They were made to do hard labour. This was both to deter them from opposing the Nazis again in future, but also to assist the Nazis' economic goals. For example, prisoners in some camps were made to extract useful raw materials through mining, or to produce weapons as part of the Nazis' rearmament programme. After completing their sentence, surviving prisoners were released on the condition that they mended their ways and kept out of politics. This is what makes concentration camps different from the death camps, which developed later as part of the Nazis' final solution to exterminate Jews and other undesirables. Now let's look at the changes which the Nazis made to the legal system in Germany. We'll divide this into changes made to the courts and changes made to judges. Firstly, the courts themselves. The Nazis were worried that juries might return verdicts which displeased them, so they abolished the right to trial by jury. All lawyers had to join the German Lawyers' Front, which meant that they could be controlled. There were about 100,000 members within a year. The Nazis also set up special people's courts from 1934 onwards. they were to hear trials of people accused of treason, which means crimes against the state or against the government. In these courts, there was no right to appeal against the decision of the judge. The death sentence was frequently given in the People's Court. Indeed, the Nazis increased the number of crimes which carried the death penalty from 3 to 46. These included, for example, telling anti-Nazi jokes. The Nazis also changed judges too. All judges were made to join the National Socialist League for the Maintenance of Law. Being a member of the League meant that judges had to prioritise Nazi principles above the law. Those who did not join were no longer allowed to work as judges. All judges were made to swear an oath of loyalty to the Nazi state. Special care was taken over the choice of judges for the People's Court. They were handpicked for their loyalty. For example, Ronald Freisler was favoured because of his strong Nazi views on race. He handed out guilty verdicts in 90% of the cases he heard. These changes to the legal system mattered. Firstly, they made sure that the courts upheld Nazi views. Courtrooms were no longer neutral. Secondly, they took away any chance which opponents had of receiving a fair trial. In most cases, the guilty verdict was a certainty. Thirdly, the courts were a key part of the police state. They were used by the Nazis to remove possible opponents. Often, the Nazis did this by using the courts to imprison suspected opponents on technicalities, for example, currency fraud. It all made opposition more difficult. Before we go any further, here's a diagram showing the main features of the Nazi police state. Try pausing the video and doing one of these revision tasks. Either talk through the different parts of the police state. Explain to yourself out loud what each part was and what they did. The other option is to make a copy of the diagram and add detail under each of the headings from memory. Then watch the video again, adding any points which you forgot about or missed out. So, how effective was the Nazi police state? Historians' views on this question have changed over time. Let's consider two different views about the effectiveness of the police state. In the years immediately after the Second World War, historians placed a lot of emphasis on how efficient the police state was at removing opposition. There is some evidence to show that the police state was effective in finding and removing opponents. Nazi police forces certainly did arrest large numbers of opponents. For example, in 1939 alone, they arrested 160,000, and the total number imprisoned was 600,000 by 1939. And in the period 1933 to 1939, over 1 million Germans served time in a concentration camp. However, we should be careful not to exaggerate how effective the police state was at removing opponents. After all, at its peak, there were only about 30,000 Gestapo in a country of over 80 million people. Huge cities like Frankfurt had only 30 Gestapo agents. They could not possibly be everywhere and monitor everybody. In fact, they were often overwhelmed with paperwork. This meant that they were reliant on informers and denunciations or reports by ordinary Germans accusing others of suspect behaviour. A lot of these reports wasted Gestapo time as they were motivated by petty personal rivalries. In fact, far from arresting anybody who broke Nazi laws, the Gestapo often overlooked minor law breaking by ordinary Germans and focused on a small number of political enemies. In more recent years, historians have taken a different view. They argue that the real effectiveness of the police state was the way that it terrorised people into conformity. There is evidence to support this view. Even though we know now that the Gestapo could not possibly track all opposition, many ordinary Germans at the time did believe that it could strike anywhere at any time, and therefore they feared it. They were terrified of being arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Rumours spread about what went on at the camps. Indeed, photos of the camps were published in the press in order to spread exactly this sort of fear among the population. Another key piece of evidence is the way that the number of reports to and arrests by the Gestapo dropped sharply over the period. This suggests that increasingly Germans refrained from any behaviour which opposed the Nazis because they feared what might happen to them if they were caught. So the police state acted as a deterrent. Germans conformed because they feared the consequences of getting caught. However, the big problem for historians here is that it is difficult for us to tell whether Germans conformed through fear or through support. Perhaps it was due to the fear they felt of the police agencies. On the other hand, we also know a significant proportion of the population conformed because they supported the Nazis and they were grateful for the economic improvements made during the period. Now, if you're keen to follow up on this further, here's an interpretation question which you could have a go at based on two different historians' views of the police state. And if you would like to take this even further, here's an explain question you could have a go at using your notes from the video. Thanks for watching. If the tutorial was helpful, then don't forget to like the video. You could help a friend out by sharing the link to the video with them. There are videos covering the rest of the Germany content on our YouTube channel, as well as Paper 3 exam technique. And remember, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already become one of our followers.